Good evening, everyone. Thanks for coming here this evening to the Mill Valley Library. Look, it's still light outside. The day is settling. It's beautiful. Lovely day to be looking at nature, to be enjoying nature, and to be hearing about nature. My name is Deborah Schwartz, and I'm with the Mill Valley Historical Society. I'm in charge of the oral history program, and I host a lot of these first Wednesdays. And I'm always so very pleased when we have a speaker that talks about Mount Tam or nature. And that's what we have here this evening. Now, I have to confess, I've been hiking all day myself, so I don't have a huge intro prepared, but I do have a little background history on Jim here. He's a native of St. Louis. He graduated from Stanford University and earned his law degree at Stanford Law School. Impressive. He practiced law for many years in San Francisco and Marin, mostly. And for more than 45 years, Jim has lived in Marin County, hiking its trails, loving its spirit, and becoming an avid student of its unique history, culture, and lore. So that's just the kind of person we like to have speak here at the library. And before he is going to talk about his experiences on the other side of the mountain from us who live in Mill Valley, I did want to remind you that how the day is going to go, so this evening's talk is going to go. First, Jim's going to be speaking for about, how long?
45 minutes.
45 minutes. Many of you have been here. How many haven't been here? Yeah, there's a couple of people. 45 minutes, then we'll have a Q&A, and then with your help, we'll put some of these chairs away because we always want to be helpful with the library. We're so grateful to be here tonight in this beautiful library, and one of the ways we show our gratitude is by putting the room back in order. And then, after the presentation and the Q&A, that's the time to buy books here and have them signed by the author and have a little community time. I always like to have an intro that has a little something special about the speaker, and so I called him today and asked him, this is a wonderful book, and it has so many stories in it, but might there be a particular story or something personal that happened in this vicinity on Mount Tam that isn't in the book? And so I got a little story I'd like to share with you today. And I think it really represents what it is for those of us who love the mountain and experience the mountain, what the experience is in expressing that. So you might have to help me a little bit, but this is when you were at Lake Lagunitas, right? And he was just pulling into the parking lot, and there was a photographer there, right?
Above the parking lot, on the lake.
On the lake. And there was a guy there who had a look about him.
Well, he had a bunch of equipment there.
A lot of equipment. And he says to Jim, I just missed the best picture of my career. Right?
Right. So is probably February when the ospreys are frequently above Lake Log. And so he was watching this osprey, and it dived down, picked up a fish, rose, and right then a bald eagle came and started harassing the osprey. Made the osprey drop the fish. The bald eagle then picked it clean out of the air before it hit the water. And the photographer said, I just watched it. I never got a picture.
And why I love this story is because for those of us who are out there all the time and who love the mountain, really no photograph and no story really represents how amazing it is. But we love it so much, we try, and that's exactly what this book is. It's a book of love, really, of how the experiences that you've had on the mountain and all the stories that he collected. But you'll talk more about why these stories. But I love that story about the bird, and I thank you so much for being here today. And I think I'm just going to hand this over to you.
Okay, thank you. Let's see if this works here. How's this working? You can hear me? Good. Thank you, Deborah. Thank you all for coming out tonight. Thank you to the Historical Society for inviting me. I started this book about 3.5 years ago, and I wrote, I was ratcheting down my law practice, and I wrote a few pages, and I handed them to my wife, who is, of course, my best reader, and she's very discreet, but of course, we've been married a long time, so you know what she's trying to tell you. And she was very diplomatic, but basically she said, "It sucks." I mean, she didn't say it at all like that. She said, "Is this what you want to write about?" So, so I sent it off to a friend of mine who's been a friend of mine for 50 years, and he's been writing. He's a pretty acclaimed author and had a publishing company and had taught writing. And I said, "Hey, Paul, what do you think?" And he said, you know, he also was pretty diplomatic. He said, "Turn off your lawyer brain and just tell stories. You're a good storyteller, but we don't want to hear from lawyers." So I tried to follow that advice, and I wrote, basically, I only had 2 criteria for what was in the book. It had to be one of the 10 most interesting stories about Marin to me, and it had to have an impact on Marin. Before I get started, I want to thank a few people. I want to thank my wife, without whom there would be no book. My wife, Mary, who's our AV assistant here, and my publisher and friend who I talked about, a fellow named Paul Chutkow, who published the book under his publishing company, Valdegrass Books. And there are two local people, 2 local Marinites who also contributed to the book. Many of you know Brad Rippe, and he's got a portfolio of photographs in the book. There's no one who knows more about Tam than Brad, and he's got about 20 beautiful photographs in the book, and really, really a crucial part. And Brad, I can't even find you. There you are. Okay. Anyway, if you don't know Brad, there he is. You're going to see some of his photographs. And the other fellow, it's funny, I don't think that many people know him, but he's the best hiking map preparer in the United States, certainly in California. A fellow named Tom Harrison lives in San Rafael. He's got about 75 maps out there, and he's got the only map of a chapter I'll talk about called The Big Empty. And his maps are the Bible of the John Muir Trail and throughout the Sierra, and he's got maps of all of Marin. So anyway, another local participant. Okay, I think I'll just get started. I'm going to make I've given this talk in various ways before, but for you guys have been tammed to death in a way. And so I'll spend a very little time on your side of the mountain, and I'll put a little more stress on the north side of the mountain, which you're probably less familiar with because it's harder to get to. It's a little more inconvenient, but we'll talk about that. So anyway, this is a Brad Rippe photo of Tam, and I'm just going to read a very short extract from that story, and then we'll get on with it. Rising above the landscape, Mount Tam pulls people to it. They come and change the mountain. When they leave, they found the mountain has changed them. Tam has always reflected the world around it. The Great Depression forced scores of people to live illegally in hidden camps on the mountain. World War II brought in the armed forces, which took over some of the best sites. In the 1950s, Jack Kerouac and the Beats came to Mount Tam and wrote beautifully about it. The hippies happened and opened the Summer of Love on the mountain with a groundbreaking rock festival. Later, the Trailside Killer brought murder to Tam, and a group of free-spirited bikers rode their mountain hobby into a new sport. The one thing I want to say about Tam before I go on to the other stories is that the mountain really changed Tam overnight. Before the railroad came, I don't know what I said, before the railroad changed Tam overnight. Before the railway, the upper slopes of Tam were hardly known. In fact, the first documented climb of Tam was in 1862 when William Brewer and his State Geographical Party made the ascent. It probably had been climbed before, but there's no reliable documentation of it. Anyway, Brewer spent the night at Colonel McDuff's cabin, and part of this is from Brad Rippey, who's really done the research on Brewer. But Brewer spent the night there, and then they climbed Rocky Ridge to the west peak, which is the highest part of the mountain. It was terrible weather. The sun cleared when they were up there, and in his journal he notes that. A lot of this stuff isn't in his journal, unfortunately, that was published up in down California, 1860 to 1864. But anyway, then they went over to East Peak and went down to Sausalito. So that trail became sort of a trail to get to the top of Tam. And in 1871, Bancroft published a travel guide to the Bay Area. And in it, he mentions a trail and that you can rent horses to get to the top of Tam. And there's actually an advertisement from the Tamalpais Hotel in San Rafael, which was the big hotel in Marin at that time. And it advertised that you could rent horses to get to the top of Tam, $3 for gentlemen, $4 for ladies. The start. Okay. Hold it. Go back. I'm sorry. So in 1873, the first really detailed county map had the trail that went to the top of Tam. And you can see it here starting at the top. I think I've got let's see here somewhere. I've got oh, here we go. Yeah. So essentially, coming here, to the top. And so it was a trail that was noted on the map, one of the few trails. It was that important. It was soon eclipsed when Elridge Grade was put in 84, and then the railroad started operating in 1896. The railroad took 23,000 passengers to the top of Tam in the first year of its operation, more than it ever climbed to the top of Tam previous to that. And in its years of operation from 1896 to 1930, it took about 1 million people to the top. So in some ways, Tam was, by reason of its popularity, was destined in hindsight to become public land. You all know the double bow knot, and you can see the train on it. But look how undeveloped everything is. It's pretty amazing. What? It wasn't snow. Yeah, it's not snow. And here was a bird's eye view that the railroad put out, and it just shows some of the locations on Tam. Okay, the next story is about Angela Davis, and you all probably know the story. There's the FBI wanted poster. You know the start, you probably know the end. The details are really fascinating. Okay. The third story is about Muir Woods, and there are three main actors in Muir Woods. President Teddy Roosevelt, William Kent, who's really the giant as far as preservation in Marin, and John Muir. John Muir actually had nothing to do with it. He was even surprised that it was named after him, but we'll get there in a little bit. This is obviously at Yosemite on Glacier Point. You can see Yosemite Falls. The story really talks about the rescue of Muir Woods, and William Kent is certainly the main actor. He bought and gave Muir Woods to the federal government, but we would never have Muir Woods. It would have been developed as a reservoir if it were not for President Roosevelt. And so this story also gives the background of the personal tragedy that happened to Roosevelt that really hardened and seared the conservation ethic into him. And I think it's not so well known, but pretty impressive that during his time, he created and expanded the national parks and the national forest system and public lands in general. He was responsible for putting aside 10% of the United States' present landmass for the public. It's just unbelievable. So a little of that story's in there. And then, of course, Kent, Roosevelt, and Muir were on the same side as far as the preservation of Muir Woods. But that alliance split up over Hetch Hetchy with John Muir on one side and Roosevelt and Kent, who by then was a representative on the other side, who thought that using Hetch Hetchy to supply thirsty San Francisco with water was the best use for the most people. There's William Kent, nice looking fellow, our giant of preservation. And as you know, he, the day before he died, he gave the first land for Mount Tam State Park, the steep ravine. Okay, this is the fourth story, the righteous and the rattler. Not sure how many of you know who that is. That's a fellow named Chuck Dedrick or Charles Dedrick. He was the founder of Synanon. And this story out in West Marin, he is also, ironically, the originator of the now hackneyed phrase, "Today is the first day of the rest of your life." We won't talk about that. But this story is really the most shocking story. I mean, the Angela Davis story is shocking, but this story is even more shocking than that, I think. The Dedrick started out for the good. He was an alcoholic, 2 failed marriages because of his alcoholism, entered AA, became one of the most popular speakers for AA. Then he started his own sort of rehab clinic, this patterned after AA. Pretty soon, what he called dope fiends started showing up. And so he took the drug addicts and kicked out the alcoholics because AA was already there. And so he did a lot of good. And then as power seems to do, and absolute power does absolutely, he became somewhat corrupt and really turned to the dark side. And so this is a chilling story. Many of you will have sort of, it's all vague because the IJ hardly had anything about it. Those were the days where you actually had to read a newspaper, and the IJ was sort of intimidated to put anything negative about Synanon in it. But stories, I was here, many of you were here, stories would seep back, but it was all vague. Then the Point Reyes Light got involved, but unless you live at Point Reyes, who reads the Point Reyes Light? And then the rattlesnake happened, and then the thing just blew apart. And so it's a really chilling, interesting story. Okay, I'm going to talk a little more than I usually do about this. This is Lagunitas. This is a Brad Rippe photo. And this is Lagunitas Creek right below the spillway at Lake Lagunitas on that short stretch to Bontempi. And it's after a hard rain, as you can tell. Lagunitas Creek starts about 50 yards below the visitor center on East Peak. And it runs 22, 23, depends on how you measure the curves, to Tamalpais Bay, where it flows into Tamalpais Bay. And along the way, it stitches together 4 of our reservoirs. In fact, it's responsible for 4 of our reservoirs. There's Lake Lagunitas, Bontempi, Alpine Lake, Kent Lake, and then one of its tributaries is Nicasio Creek, and there's Nicasio Reservoir there on its tributary. So those the last 4 that I mentioned, Bontempi, Alpine, Kent, and Nicasio, in normal times, supply basically the bulk of Marin's water. In fact, they supply 75% of the Marin water served by MMWD. The other 25% is piped in from Sonoma, but Lagunitas Creek basically supplies your water. Now, the history is pretty fascinating because it's all attributable to, next pick, this dude. Anybody know who he is? That's William Coleman. He's hardly known now. But William Coleman was famous by the time he came to Marin. In 1856, San Francisco was particularly lawless and corrupt. And a group of prominent San Francisco citizens came to Coleman, and they said, would you head up basically a huge group of vigilantes? They called it the Vigilance Committee, or Committee of Vigilance. And he thought about it for 2 or 3 days, and he said, okay. And within just a few days, they had 7,000 San Francisco members of this vigilante group. It wasn't a wild, lawless, it was maybe lawless, but it wasn't a wild, disorganized group. They had actually protocols and rules, and they had trials, etc. But anyway, Coleman took over, and then the governor came down and called a meeting with Coleman because he was distressed that they were going to take over law and order in San Francisco. And he tried to back Coleman down, and Coleman said, look, we're going to do what the city of San Francisco and the state have refused and been unable to do. We're going to bring justice to San Francisco, clean it up. And so the governor, he backed down the governor, and the governor left, and then he returned with William Tecumseh Sherman, later of Civil War fame. And they tried again, and Coleman said, hey, we're not interested in long-term. We're just trying to get rid of the really serious criminal elements. And finally, Coleman compromised. He thought, okay, let's not get into a fight here. And so he had an agreement with the governor. and then provided that the government did what it said it was going to do, he'd withhold action on behalf of the Committee of Vigilance. And the next morning, the governor reneged on his agreement. Coleman got in front of the members and he said, the time has come. And the next morning, a Sunday morning, 3,000 people, 3,000 members from all different parts of the city marched in companies with bayonets or guns over their shoulder, and they marched to the city jail, and they took, and Coleman entered with a few of them. They all arrived at the jail at the same time, and Coleman walked into the jail accompanied by a few of them, and the sheriff and the deputies were all stationed in the jail with loaded shotguns. And Coleman said, guys, I got 3,000 people out there. I don't think you want to fight. Just surrender peacefully. That's our intention. And so they took 2 murderers, and they tried the 2 murderers both. And the Vigilance Committee had 2 forms of punishment only. They either executed you. Well, they could acquit you, but if they didn't acquit you, they either executed you or they sent you out on a boat in steerage. And so they executed the 2 murderers after trying, and in all they executed 4 and shipped out about 30. And actually, a lot of criminals left, and San Francisco had its first honest election. And a lot of people say that the Vigilance Committee was good, and some thought of it as restoring law and order, and some thought of it as an attack on law and order. But nobody ever doubted Coleman's integrity or vision or leadership abilities. So he came to Marin in 1871. He bought 1870, I guess. I'm mixing up my years, but 1870, 1871. He bought the Irwin Ranch in San Rafael, about 1,100 acres, where the Dominican area is now. And he planned to put in mostly housing, but it was a real estate development. And he knew that the water supply was insufficient, because water in those days in Marin was, you were tethered by two local sources, creeks, wells, and springs. Creeks, wells, and springs. And if you didn't have one, you didn't build. And so he decided, within a month of making his purchase, he formed the Marin Water Company, and they could use eminent domain, and using eminent domain as a lever, he bought the basin where Lake Lagunitas is now, the water sources above. Actually, some of the water sources for Phoenix Lake, Phoenix Lake didn't exist, either to Lake Lagunitas, but and some of the water rights downstream, and created Lake Lagunitas. Now, the impetus for it was his own real estate development, but financing of it was dependent on San Quentin, because San Quentin was hauling their water in from 2 miles away. And so San Quentin contracted to pay $1,000 a month for water. And that was more than the Marin Water Company was going to get from all their other customers combined. San Quentin is still the biggest water user in Marin. Anyway, they serviced San Quentin from Bill Williams Creek in 1872. And then in 1873, they built Lake Lagunitas and serviced San Rafael and San Quentin from Lake Lagunitas. And then they brought in Ross Valley 4 years later. They also, Coleman was pretty visionary. They had the first telephone in Marin. And so people would go to and the telephone line ran from the Lake Lagunitas Dam to the corporate office in San Rafael. And people would just go into the corporate office to hear the dam keeper's voice from several miles away. It was quite astonishing to them. What year? 1870. Oh, the telephone, 1877. So things went along. The problem with Marin County at that time, as far as water went, is that there were over a score of water companies. They were all private, and they were all trying to make a profit. And so the water rates were high, the water supply was unreliable. And Marin's representative to the state introduced a bill for municipal water companies. And it passed, and Marin was the first county to adopt, to organize and give approval to authorize a municipal water company, MMWD, Marin Municipal Water District. Problem with that was, okay, now we've got a water district. They had no land, they had no water. So they floated a bond issue. And the bond issue passed, and they bought Lake Lagunitas and Phoenix Lake, and obviously the water sources to them. And they also promised to construct with the funds, $3 million of bonds were issued. They just promised to construct Alpine Dam. And they had one additional promise, very, very, very important, which was that all of the municipal water lands would be public, open to the public. And you can contrast that. I mean, that might not seem like such a big deal, but contrast it to Crystal Springs, just down the peninsula. You know, it's still private, right? And they're still fighting to get access to it. So it was really a good thing. And so by 1917, they had acquired some 10,800 acres on the mountain, all the north side, including it drips over the peaks. And they built Alpine Lake. It was finished in 1919, and the public was entitled to use all of that part. So I know you probably know this history. So we've got Muir Woods that's public, and we've got the MMWD on the north side that's public over the three peaks. And the middle section, the ocean-facing section, the section you guys use, and the section where the railway emptied people and where everybody hiked, was still not public. I mean, it was actually open to the public, and the public used it, but it was owned privately. And so Mount Tam State Park came into existence, depending on what you call as coming into existence, in 28, 29, 30, somewhere in there. And that pretty much, I mean, there still have been many purchases since then. Mount Tam State Park started out so slender with a steep ravine area, and then gradually expanded over the years, but I'm not going to talk about that. So anyway, this is a Brad Rippe photo from Pilot's Knob, right, Brad? Yeah. So this is Lake Lagunitas, and it's really a beautiful lake, as you can see, if you haven't been there. A great hike around it. 3 forks come into it, and the middle fork, there's a fork coming into it. And there's a leg of it that's going, that you can't see in this photo, but it comes back here. I'm not sure quite where it ends, but there's a leg going there. And then some area back there. Okay, next one. And the next dam, you know, it's just less than a quarter mile from Lake Log to Bontempi. And I took that photo just a couple months ago. It's not in the book, from the Upper North Side Trail. And this area is called Sunny, and that side's called Shady. And you know, a lot of people run or hike along. Where you want to go, Sunny or Shady? And then the dam's down there. And Alpine Lake is just right below it, actually. It's sort of like, looks almost like a holding pond, except it's bigger than a pond for Alpine. Okay, next. And we'll get downstream later in the book, but this obviously is the Golden Gate Bridge. I'd like to read you just a brief excerpt from it. There's really, in a way, three stories in the Golden Gate Bridge. It's from the Marin point of view. Well, let me read a little bit. San Francisco has long dominated the story of the Golden Gate Bridge and claimed it as the city's symbol. But the story on the Marin side is even more interesting. The bridge changed Marin more than any event in its history. Then, years later, the bridge forced Marin to make another choice about its future, a choice that has differentiated it from other Bay Area counties and defined Marin ever since. Now, I'll get there later. The drama of the bridge has many aspects besides its beauty: the arduous campaign for it, the revolutionary design, the engineering marvel, and its difficult, perilous construction. Yet, it might never have existed without two men, a brilliant, far-sighted engineer named Joseph Strauss and A.P. Giannini, the founder and moving force behind Bank of America. By August 1932, Strauss had worked tirelessly for 13 years to bring the bridge into existence, but hope for the bridge was at a low. He had designed it, promoted it, overcome the military's objection, and helped guide it through the gauntlet of approvals and lawsuits. Still, there was no bridge, and Strauss was worried. It was the Depression. Construction of the bridge had not yet begun, and the bridge district had no money to build it. On August 4, 1932, a desperate Strauss walked into Bank of America to plead for the life of the Golden Gate Bridge. He sat down at a desk, no different from those surrounding it, except for the man behind it, A.P. Giannini. Strauss knew that Giannini, then synonymous with Bank of America, was the last best hope for money to build the bridge. Strauss and Giannini were not so different. Both had imaginations far beyond the conventional and acted upon their singular visions. Strauss had dreamed of and worked toward the bridge for 13 years and did not want it to die now for lack of money. Giannini knew the life and death value of money from a different perspective. At age 6, he had witnessed his father's murder in a wage dispute over $2. But we are getting ahead of our story. So anyway, the Golden Gate Bridge story is really three. It starts with the lead up to the bridge, the construction of the bridge, and then, of course, Marin just, the population just exploded because you had the bridge leading to Marin and you had the end of World War II. And so the population exploded, and ultimately in the late 60s and 70s, the bridge was so congested and Highway 101 was so congested that it played a significant part in bringing about growth restraints to Marin. Anyway, it's from the Marin perspective. I think it's an interesting story. The next Next is Brad's picture portfolio, and I think there are 16 pictures in this portfolio, and that's a great picture of the bridge, and it's in the portfolio, and it also caps the Golden Gate Bridge story. This is Outer Point Rays. This is actually in the Big Empty, and we'll get to the Big Empty, but you might see these I don't know if you can see them or not. Probably you can. The turkey vulture there and right there. They're circling an exhausted hiker. Anybody know where that is? I didn't when I saw it. It's actually White's Hill. And then when I looked for it, I could see it. But, beautiful, huh? If you drive over White's Hill, you'll see it. That's just 3 of the portfolio. This is a barrel buck. And I got a lot of this story is really virtually unknown, but I was friends with Gary Giacomini, really close friends for the last 20 plus years of his life, and we'd talk about every day and eat lunch once a week, and my wife and I would go out with his wife and him for dinner and social events. So I got to hear a lot of stories, some of them true, some of them not. But he was the lead man in trying to keep the Buck Trust in Marin. This is the story of the assault on the Buck Trust and how it culminated and good things happened. Gary is pretty outspoken. As soon as he had suggested, yeah, he called them grave robbing bastards anyway. Yeah, there's Gary. He's cowboying around Point Reyes. Claims, you see the Western Saloon there on the left side, claims he rode the horse into the Western Saloon, ordered a drink, downed it, threw some coins onto the counter and rode the horse out. But his wife says he didn't do it. Whatever. Okay. Now we're in the Big Empty. And this is a Brad Rippe photo. He was going along Pine Mountain Road, Fire Road, and he says he saw the coyote sitting there and was just like posing for him. He's getting his camera. He thinks the coyote's going to take off. Snaps about 20 photos of it. The coyote looks at him. You got enough? Saunters off. Anyway, I'd like to read a little bit from The Big Empty, just so you get an idea of it. Somehow The Big Empty is one of the stories that's caught a lot of people's fancy. The Big Empty. I call Marin's wildest, rawest, least touched area the Big Empty. Walled in on 2 sides by high ridges, the vast, relatively unknown hiker's dreamscape holds some colorful threads of Marin history, featuring Paul Revere's grandson, Kit Carson, and Marin's largest fire since the 1800s. The Big Empty can be harsh country, but it is magnificent. It contains Marin's 3rd highest mountain, 3 strong creeks, a high cascading waterfall, a lake, 10,000 public acres, and few visitors. Its fascinating past has kept it remote and undeveloped. You can drive to the Big Empty, but not into it. The land is open to the public, but no public roads intrude upon it. To enter it, you need to hike, bike, or ride a horse over one of its few fire roads or trails. The lack of automobile access must account for its general lack of visitors. There is no other excuse. So, the Big Empty, there's Big Carson Creek, Little Carson Creek, and on Little Carson Creek is Carson Falls. And it got its name Carson from Kit Carson. And here's how it happened. So in 1846, Paul Revere's grandson, a guy named Joseph Warren Revere, was landed with the ship that proclaimed California, July 1846, proclaimed California as part of the United States. Of course, it was owned by Mexico then. And a couple days later, he went to Sonoma and raised the American flag in Sonoma. The Bear Flag Rebellion, which was in Sonoma, had already occurred, where they raised the grizzly bear California flag. But that was sort of group of settlers that did that, and there was no wider thing. Fremont was in, what's Fremont's first name all of a sudden? Yeah, John Fremont was in California. Kit Carson was the guide in taking him west when the Bear Flag Rebellion occurred. And he actually stopped at the San Rafael Mission for a while, and there's somewhat of a black mark against Kit Carson that occurred there. I didn't address it in the story. I addressed it in the notes because it didn't quite fit into the story. So anyway, Revere's became the commander of a 50-man garrison in Sonoma. And he'd travel and hunt in Point Reyes, and on one of his trips, he goes through the San Geronimo Valley, and he decides he wants to own it. So in October of 1846, he buys the San Geronimo land grant, about 8,800, 8,700, 8,800 acres from San Geronimo all the way to the top of Pine Mountain, to the summit of Pine Mountain. And there's Kit Carson, by the way. So anyway, he stays with the American Armed Forces, and Fremont sends Carson back to tell in September to tell the president that they have conquered California. And Carson's crossing the desert. It's from Southern California. He crosses that fearsome desert, and he gets into New Mexico, and he's been through Indian country, and he's just beat to heck. And he runs into Kearny, General Kearny, who's coming west to help fight the war. And Kearny says, "You're going to turn around and take me to California." And Carson says, "No, I've got orders to go to see the president." And Kearny says, "I outrank Fremont. You're going back with me to California." And so Carson turns around and leads Fremont back, and they soon discover that Fremont's message to the president that California is all in United States hands was untrue, because the armed forces, the American forces, controlled from Monterey north, but the Mexican forces controlled from south of Monterey, except for San Diego. So anyway, Carson by then Revere's in San Diego. It's December. By the time Carson gets Kearny back, it's December of 46, and Kearny gets pinned down by the Mexican forces. And so he sends Carson to San Diego to get help. Well, it's about 20 miles, and Carson starts going, and there are Mexican forces all around, and he's noticing that his moccasins are making too much noise, so he takes them off. Well, then it gets to be night. Anyway, Carson goes for 30 hours without food or water. He walks 20 miles at night barefoot through the desert, and his feet are punctured and ripped and cut and everything, and he staggers into San Diego at 3 a.m. and says, "Kearny needs help," and Carson actually can't walk for the next week, but it's sort of, he was already very famous by then, and it aggrandized his legend. And Revere, on his part, wrote 3 books, and in all the books he mentions Kit Carson. And this, can you go back a little bit? And so this is on his land. He bought the San Geronimo land grant. I don't think I'll go over there. Okay, let's see. There we go. So that he named this Carson Creek, and this is from an 1859 map of the San Geronimo land grant, the U.S. official map. And Revere owned the San Geronimo land grant from 46. He sold half of it in 51 and half of it in 53. And during that, by 59, it was already known as Carson Creek. So he named it this Carson Creek. And then Little Carson Creek was named several years after, and then they named Carson Creek Big Carson Creek to differentiate it from Little Carson Creek. Okay. That's Carson, and here's the Big Empty. So I don't know how many of you are familiar with this area. If you know Pine Mountain Road or you've ridden the Pine Mountain Loop on your bike, but basically the only place that the public road goes is it grazes it from Fairfax Bolinas Road. Let me see here. Getting a little mixed up. Here's the Azalea Hill parking lot and the Alpine Lake Dam. Yeah. But it says dam somewhere. Yeah. The pump trail. Why am I having so much trouble here? The pump road. Oh, okay. Yeah, right here. Here we go. Alpine Dam. And here's the Kent Pump Road into Kent Lake, and I'll talk about that. But what I talk about in the book, because the main area of the Big Empty, by the way, here's Bolinas Ridge. This is Kent Lake. It's basically what they did is they just dammed it up there, and this is Lagunitas Creek, flows through here, and then it makes this turn, and it's called Lagunitas Canyon, and they just flooded it. So Kent Lake looks like a river when you're looking at it. It's just a long, narrow drink of water. And the problem is you don't ever get to see Kent Lake, or you see just a really small slice. Like if you take the Kent Lake, the Kent Pump Trail in, you come and it looks like you're going to see it, but all you do is it looks like a big pond. It's just you don't get to see much, and the reason is because there are twists and turns in the canyon, and the top of the canyon, the top of the bluffs, or the canyon tops are about 1,000 feet above the creek, and so it's always hidden wherever you go. Very frustrating because it's Marin's biggest reservoir by far, and you'd think it would be a real landmark, but since you can't ever see it, it's not much of a landmark. So anyway, in the book, I talk about going from the Azalea Hill parking area right here. You go up Pine Mountain Fire Road, and you turn over here, and I'll talk about this. This takes you up to Rippe. Right there. That's the famous biking trail when they had invented the mountain biking. It's covered in chapter 1, but Rippe, because they had to repack their brake bearings. But anyway, you go up Pine Mountain Fire Road, and you come here, and there's the summit. And the summit's a little bit off the fire road. It's about 50 yards, I'd say. And it used to be really narrow. You could hardly see it, but I was up there about a week ago, and it's been widened out, so you really do get to see the trail to the summit. And at the summit, there's a low stone wall about that high. Sometimes it's that high, and it runs both ways. And right at the summit, there's a pile of stones with a small stake in it. And if you can see Kent Lake, I think, going up, and you can definitely see it going down a little bit if you continued on. Takes, by the way, if you got to be in pretty good shape because it's steep, but it's not that big a deal. It takes you about an hour to get to the summit from the parking area. And then if you go down, and oh yeah, there it is. Okay, so there's a a spur road that goes to Poison Spring Tank, and if you go right here, there's you go past that and you go up a hill, and it's maybe, I'm going to say 250 yards, and you get to the top, and there's a low red post that says SG 21, San Geronimo 21. It's a survey marker. And from there, you get to see a huge section of the lake. You get to see basically somewhere down here and maybe up to about right there. So you get to see a pretty big expanse, except it's blocked right here by a hill. And so if you just take you walk 75 yards or so along just through grass to the brow of the bluff, and you can see the whole expanse. Anyway, the Big Empty, the thing that probably some of you have hiked to has been Carson Falls, right there. And it's a shorter hike, and you go up, there's a few ways, but one of the easier ways is to just go up Pine Mountain Road, and you take this Oat Hill Road. There's a left turn on Oat Hill Road, and then you climb down, and it's pretty easy. They've engineered a good trail there. You used to have to go down a really steep, slippery hill. And anyway, Carson Falls is riparian, beautiful, and go on. So anyway, this is Kent Lake. This is a great photo that Brad took. This is from an airplane, and it's during the 77-78 drought. And so you can see Kent Lake's empty. Look at that. It's just unbelievable. And so you can see the canyon. Since it's from an airplane, it doesn't look as steep as it looks when you're on the ground. It's a lot steeper. Okay. And here's a photo I took. I just climbed out to the brow. So you can still see there's quite still a very steep climb if you were to try to get down there. And this is just a smaller section of Kent Lake, but this was taken about a year and a half ago. Anyway, this is Bolinas Ridge. Okay, I'm going to leave the Big Empty for a while, but if you're at all inclined, there are two things on the north side that are highlighted. One is water. There's a lot of water, and the second is solitude. I was up just in the Big Empty, I guess about a week and a half ago, and I took a guy who really wanted to go, and we saw nobody going in. We started about 9:30 in the morning and started climbing. We saw zero. We spent 2.5 hours, and then on the way back we saw 2 bike riders. That's it. So it's really some amazing far views from up the top. You can see any direction as far as you can see. You see no structures. Okay, so this is a woman named Martha Bucklew, much ignored in history, but she was responsible for Marin's first practical commute, or played a significant role in it. She came over the mountains in 1846 by wagon train with her husband and 2 kids. She was driving her husband was ill, and she was tending to him, and she was driving the oxen, chopping the wood, cooking the meals, doing everything and taking care of the kids and her husband. She was a resourceful, strong woman. Her party in the wagon train was the last party over the Sierra before the snowstorm came and snowed in the Donner Party. Yeah, they were the last ones over before the Donner Party. Anyway, her her husband bought 3 land grants in Marin, owned about, I forget, like a third or almost a half of Marin. One of them he lost in litigation. He is basically known, his name Benjamin. He's known primarily for selling the land to the state for San Quentin prison. And anyway, he basically ran into financial difficulties, had physical difficulties. He died, leaving Martha virtually nothing. So a year before he died, she posted a notice as required by law. Then for women to start your own business, you needed to publish that you were doing it. And, there are all sorts of discriminations against women. If you were going to invest more than $5,000, you needed your husband's consent, and the statute reminded you that even though you were starting your own business, you were still responsible for raising the children. And of course, the statute insulated men from any liability for their foolish wife's debts. Anyway, she posted the notice, and she was going to build a wharf on a thing called Agnes Island, which doesn't exist anymore. If you know San Quentin Point San Quentin, where the Richmond Bridge takes off, there was this little speck of an island, and this is a road that they built. So you can see that road takes up a decent part of the island, and then over here is the wharf that she built. And here's the wharf she built. And here's the train coming to the wharf. And the train came from San Rafael to Agnes Island in 1870. It took 7 to 10 minutes from San Rafael to the wharf. You got off the train, you got on the ferry. The ferry was about an hour to San Francisco. Total, let's say, an hour and 10 minutes. It's about the same as it takes nowadays. Anyway, Agnes Island disappeared, got filled in when they built the Richmond-San Rafael Bridge, so it no longer exists. But she was quite a woman, and I recommend that you read about her, just to give you an example of how much discrimination there was at the time. In 1871, the state had a sale of some marsh and tidelands, and they had a map that was published then, and every man on the map was listed by, she was the only woman who owned something on the map, and every man was listed by their initials and then their last name. Even though her husband had died 12 or 13 years earlier, she was listed as Mrs. Buckaloo, as though she was still his appendage. Anyway. Okay, so some of you might remember this if you hiked out at Point Reyes. This is a white fallow deer. I start the story with my wife and I were out at the trailhead of Bear Valley, and just then some white deer just swept across that adjacent field. It was so ghostly. It was really amazing. And later they're non-native. They were taken to Point Reyes in 1949, bought from the San Francisco Zoo and taken to Dr. Ottinger's ranch on Mount Vision. He bought them for hunting. And the fallow deer come in other colors, but he bought only the white ones. And then when just like two brunettes can have a blonde child, not all the fallow deer were white, but he also bought axis deer, which look like fawns. They've got white spots on them even when they're adults. And anyway, the Park Service called them eventually and killed them all from helicopter. And the next, because they were non-native. And but I always have sort of mourned the disappearance of some ghostly magic that you could see out there on occasion. The next to go, of course, and many of you read about it, was the oyster farms. But the present battle is between tule elk and cattle. And, the tule elk were native to Marin, and then they disappeared in the 60s from Marin. Some say the last ones swam across Tamalpais Bay, and there's other accounts. But by the early 1870s, most people thought that tule deer were extinct. And then they found a very, very small herd down near Bakersfield in the valley on the biggest ranch in California at the time. And it's funny, nobody knows quite how many there were, but there was at least a male, a stag, and a doe. And it was somewhere between 2 and 10. And all the tule elk that are in California now came from that little herd that they discovered down there. Anyway, they brought tule elk to Point Reyes in, let me see here, oh my goodness. Yeah, in 1978, they brought them back. And there, a lot of things have happened to the tule elk, and there's somewhat of a conflict between the tule elk and the cattle ranches, and I go into that in some detail, but I do want to show you one set of pictures that I think is really amazing. This is from this is a map of a development that was planned in the early 1960s, right along Limitor Beach, and you can see it. And then there's some others that are over here, and it went back, and some 200 homes. Now you're used to preservations when you see these maps, but this development actually happened. So you can see the roads back there, and you can see the beach, and go ahead. And then here's a road that was completed with the houses right at the edge of Limitor Beach, and you can see the telephone poles and place and everything. And you can see they're still building the houses, and I don't know if it's apparent, but this is the ocean right through the studs. And then the Park Service came along in 1962, and one of their very first acquisitions was of this whole development. And they removed everything except for 3 houses far back from the beach that they used for park administration. But I just think this is, most of the preservations in Marin have, in a sense, you're preserving it against an abstract development. Not that it's not real, but it's on paper, just like you saw. But this is a development which actually was put in part, and then demolished and removed. And so you get to see what it looks like. There's Limitor Beach, one of Marin's most beautiful beaches, uncontaminated by development. But there's a real black and white contrast that you really get to see. Anyway, there's some notes at the end of the book. There are primary sources if you want to do reading. That's my talk.
Thank you so much, Jim. We don't have a lot of time for Q&A. We're running a little late, but maybe just a couple of questions. And Jim, if you could repeat them out loud once you hear.
Okay. Anybody have any questions? Oh, here we go. Well, no, there's been an invasion of the Douglas fir largely because we haven't had many fires probably on Tam since, well, there's the 1929 fire, and then there was a fire in the Big Empty that started in the Big Empty and swept actually to Bolinas and up to the Mountain Theater, and that was in 1945. And those, yeah.
Any other questions?
Yeah. Yes. Yes. No, you could see that. Actually, if you take the Kent Pump Road in, you get to see. You might be able to see some nests, and you usually can see some ospreys flying around. I don't know if you'll see the eagles, but.
Okay, I think that we'll call it a night.
Okay.
I just want to remind everybody that next month we have Lou Leal from the chief historian from Jack London State Historic Park, and I'm really looking forward to that. Also, remember that in late May on Memorial Weekend, we have the Mill Valley Historical Society has its Back into History walk, and it's going to be a good one. Mill Valley grows up. And we're looking for guides, any volunteer guides that anybody cares to be a history guide, now's your chance. And other than that, I say good night to you all. Thanks so much for helping to put the chairs back on the rack, and we'll see you next time.